Chapter 27. How to banish the boredom that produces fatigue, worry, and resentment. One of the chief causes of fatigue is boredom. To illustrate, let's take the case of Alice, an executive who lives on your street. Alice came home one night utterly exhausted. She acted fatigued. She was fatigued. She had a headache. She had a backache. She was so exhausted she wanted to go to bed without waiting for dinner. Her mother pleaded. She sat down at the table. The telephone rang. The boyfriend. An invitation to a dance. Her eyes sparkled. Her spirit soared. She rushed upstairs, put on her Alice blue gown, and danced until 3 o'clock in the morning. When she finally did get home, she was not the slightest bit exhausted. She was, in fact, so exhilarated she couldn't fall asleep. Was Alice really and honestly tired 8 hours earlier when she looked and acted exhausted? Sure she was. She was exhausted because she was bored with her work, perhaps bored with life. And there are millions of Alices. You may be one of them. It's a well-known fact that your emotional attitude usually has far more to do with producing fatigue than has physical exertion. A few years ago, Joseph E. Barmak, Ph.D., published in the Archives of Psychology a report of some of his experiments showing how boredom produces fatigue. Dr. Barmak put a group of students through a series of tests in which he knew they could have little interest. The result, the students felt tired and sleepy, complained of headaches and eye strain, felt irritable. In some cases, even their stomachs were upset. Was it all imagination? No. Metabolism tests were taken of these students. These tests showed that the blood pressure of the body and the consumption of oxygen actually decrease when a person is bored, and that the whole metabolism picks up immediately as soon as he begins to feel interest and pleasure in his work. We rarely get tired when we're doing something interesting and exciting. For example, I recently took a vacation in the Canadian Rockies, up around Lake Louise. I spent several days trout fishing along Coral Creek, fighting my way through brush higher than my head, stumbling over logs, struggling through fallen timber, yet after 8 hours of this I was not exhausted. Why? Because I was excited, exhilarated. I had a sense of high achievement. 6 cutthroat trout. But suppose I'd been bored by fishing, then how do you think I would have felt? I would have been worn out by such strenuous work at an altitude of 7,000 feet. Even in such exhausting activities as mountain climbing, boredom may tire you far more than the strenuous work involved. For example, Mr. S.H. Kingman, president of the Farmers and Mechanics Savings Bank of Minneapolis, told me of an incident that's a perfect illustration of that statement. In July 1953, the Canadian government asked the Canadian Alpine Club to furnish guides to train the members of the Prince of Wales Rangers in mountain climbing. Mr. Kingman was one of the guides chosen to train these soldiers. He told me how he and the other guides, men ranging from 42 to 59 years of age, took these young army men on long hikes across glaciers and snowfields and up a sheer cliff of 40 feet where they had to climb with ropes and tiny footholds and precarious handholds. They climbed Michael's Peak, the Vice President Peak, and other unnamed peaks in the Little Yoho Valley in the Canadian Rockies. After 15 hours of mountain climbing, these young men, who were in the pink of condition, they'd just finished a 6-week course in tough commando training, were utterly exhausted. Was their fatigue caused by using muscles that had not been hardened by commando training? Any man who's ever been through commando training would hoot at such a ridiculous question. No, they were utterly exhausted because they were bored by mountain climbing. They were so tired that many of them fell asleep without waiting to eat. But the guides, men who were 2 and 3 times as old as the soldiers, were they tired? Yes, but not exhausted. The guides ate dinner and stayed up for hours talking about the day's experiences. They were not exhausted because they were interested. When Dr. Edward Thorndike of Columbia was conducting experiments in fatigue, he kept young men awake for almost a week by keeping them constantly interested. After much investigation, Dr. Thorndike is reported to have said, "Boredom is the only real cause of diminution of work." If you're a mental worker, it's seldom the amount of work you do that makes you tired. You may be tired by the amount of work you do not do. For example, remember the day last week when you were constantly interrupted, no letters answered, appointments broken, trouble here and there. Everything went wrong that day. You accomplished nothing whatever, yet you went home exhausted and with a splitting head. The next day, everything clicked at the office. You accomplished 40 times more than you did the previous day, yet you went home fresh as a snowy white gardenia. You've had that experience, so have I. The lesson to be learned, just this. Our fatigue is often caused not by work, but by worry, frustration, and resentment. While writing this chapter, I went to see a revival of Jerome Kern's delightful musical comedy Showboat. Captain Andy, captain of the Cotton Blossom, says in one of his philosophical interludes, "The lucky folks are the ones that get to do things they enjoy doing." Such folks are lucky because they have more energy, more happiness, less worry, and less fatigue. Where your interests are, there is your energy also. Walking 10 blocks with a nagging wife or husband can be more fatiguing than walking 10 miles with an adoring sweetheart. And so what? What can you do about it? Well, here's what one stenographer did about it, a stenographer working for an oil company in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For several days each month, she had one of the dullest jobs imaginable, filling out printed forms for oil leases, inserting figures and statistics. This task was so boring that she resolved in self-defense to make it interesting. How? Well, she had a daily contest with herself. She counted the number of forms she filled out each morning and then tried to excel that record in the afternoon. She counted each day's total and tried to do better the next day. Result? She was soon able to fill out more of these dull printed forms than any other stenographer in her division. And what did all this get her? Praise? No. Thanks? No. Promotion? No. Increased pay? No. But it did help to prevent the fatigue that is spawned by boredom. It did give her a mental stimulant. Because she'd done her best to make a dull job interesting, she had more energy, more zest, and got far more happiness out of her leisure hours. I happen to know this story is true because I married that girl. Here's the story of another stenographer who found it paid to act as if her work were interesting. She used to fight her work, but no more. She's Miss Valley G. Golden of Elmhurst, Illinois. Here's her story as she wrote it to me. There are 4 stenographers in my office, and each of us is assigned to take letters from several men. Once in a while we get jammed up in these assignments. One day, when an assistant department head insisted that I do a long letter over, I started to rebel. I tried to point out to him that the letter could be corrected without being retyped, and he retorted that if I didn't do it over, he would find someone else who would. I was absolutely fuming. But as I started to retype this letter, it suddenly occurred to me that there were a lot of other people who would jump at the chance to do the work I was doing. Also, that I was being paid a salary to do just that work. I began to feel better. I suddenly made up my mind to do my work as if I actually enjoyed it, even though I despised it. Then I made this important discovery. If I do my work as if I really enjoy it, then I do enjoy it to some extent. I also found I can work faster when I enjoy my work, so there's seldom any need now for me to work overtime. This new attitude of mine gained me the reputation of being a good worker. And when one of the department superintendents needed a private secretary, he asked for me for the job because he said I was willing to do extra work without being sulky. This matter of the power of a changed mental attitude, wrote Miss Golden, has been a tremendously important discovery to me. It has worked wonders. Miss Golden used the wonder-working as-if philosophy of Professor Hans Weihinger. He taught us to act as if we were happy, and so on. If you act as if you are interested in your job, that bit of acting will tend to make your interest real. It will also tend to decrease your fatigue, your tensions, and your worries. A few years ago, Harlan A. Howard made a decision that completely altered his life. He resolved to make a dull job interesting, and he certainly had a dull one, washing plates, scrubbing counters, and dishing out ice cream in the high school lunchroom while the other boys were playing ball or kidding the girls. Harlan Howard despised his job. but since he had to stick to it, he resolved to study ice cream, how it was made, what ingredients were used, why some ice creams were better than others. He studied the chemistry of ice cream and became a whiz in the high school chemistry course. He was so interested now in food chemistry that he entered the Massachusetts State College and majored in the field of food technology. When the New York Cocoa Exchange offered a $100 prize for the best paper on uses of cocoa and chocolate, a prize open to all college students, who do you suppose won it? That's right, Harlan Howard. When he found it difficult to get a job, he opened a private laboratory in the basement of his home in Amherst, Massachusetts. Shortly after that, a new law was passed. The bacteria in milk had to be counted. Harlan A. Howard was soon counting bacteria for the 14 milk companies in Amherst, and he had to hire 2 assistants. Where will he be 25 years from now? Well, the men who are now running the business of food chemistry will be retired then, or dead, and their places will be taken by young lads who are now radiating initiative and enthusiasm. 25 years from now, Harlan A. Howard will probably be one of the leaders in his profession, while some of his classmates, to whom he used to sell ice cream over the counter, will be sour, unemployed, cussing the government, and complaining that they never had a chance. Harlan A. Howard might never have had a chance either if he hadn't resolved to make a dull job interesting. Years ago, there was another young man who was bored with his dull job of standing at a lathe, turning out bolts in a factory. His first name was Sam. Sam wanted to quit, but he was afraid he couldn't find another job. Since he had to do this dull work, Sam decided he would make it interesting, so he ran a race with the mechanic operating a machine beside him. One of them was to trim off the rough surfaces on his machine, the other was to trim the bolts down to the proper diameter. They would switch machines occasionally and see who could turn out the most bolts. The foreman, impressed with Sam's speed and accuracy, soon gave him a better job. That was the start of a whole series of promotions. 30 years later, Samuel Vauclane, was president of the Baldwin Locomotive Works. But he might have remained a mechanic all his life if he'd not resolved to make a dull job interesting. H.V. Kaltenborn, the famous radio news analyst, once told me how he made a dull job interesting. When he was 22 years old, he worked his way across the Atlantic on a cattle boat, feeding and watering the steers. After making a bicycle tour of England, he arrived in Paris, hungry and broke. Pawning his camera for $5, he put an ad in the Paris edition of the New York Herald and got a job selling stereopticon machines. I can remember those old-fashioned stereoscopes we used to hold up before our eyes and look at 2 pictures exactly alike. As we looked, a miracle happened. The 2 lenses in the stereoscope transformed the 2 pictures into a single scene with the effect of a 3rd dimension. We saw distance, got an astonishing sense of perspective. Well, as I was saying, Kaltenborn started out selling these machines from door to door in Paris, and he couldn't speak French. But he earned $5,000 in commissions the first year, and made himself one of the highest-paid salesmen in France that year. H.V. Kaltenborn told me that this experience did as much to develop within him the qualities that make for success as did any single year of study at Harvard. Confidence? He told me himself that after that experience he felt he could have sold the Congressional Record to French housewives. That experience gave him an intimate understanding of French life that later proved invaluable in interpreting on the radio European events. How did he manage to become an expert salesman when he couldn't speak French? Well, he had his employer write out his sales talk in perfect French, and he memorized it. He'd ring a doorbell, a housewife would answer, and Kaltenborn would begin repeating his memorized sales talk with an accent so terrible it was funny. He would show the housewife his pictures, and when she asked a question he would shrug his shoulders and say, "An American, an American." He'd take off his hat and point to a copy of the sales talk in perfect French that he'd pasted in the top of his hat. The housewife would laugh, and he would laugh, and show her more pictures. When H.V. Kaltenborn told me about this, he confessed that the job had been far from easy. He told me there was only one quality that pulled him through: his determination to make the job interesting. Every morning before he started out, he looked into the mirror and gave himself a pep talk. Kaltenborn, you have to do this if you want to eat. Since you have to do it, why not have a good time doing it? Why not imagine every time you ring a doorbell that you're an actor before the footlights and that there's an audience out there looking at you? After all, what you're doing is just as funny as something on the stage, so why not put a lot of zest and enthusiasm into it? Mr. Kaltenborn told me that these daily pep talks helped him transform a task that he had once hated and dreaded into an adventure that he liked and made highly profitable. When I asked Mr. Kaltenborn if he had any advice to give to the young men of America who are eager to succeed, he said, "Yes, go to bat with yourself every morning." We talk a lot about the importance of physical exercise to wake us up out of the half-sleep in which so many of us walk around, but we need even more some spiritual and mental exercises every morning to stir us into action. Give yourself a pep talk every day. Is giving yourself a pep talk every day silly, superficial, childish? No, on the contrary, it is the very essence of sound psychology. Our life is what our thoughts make it. These words are just as true today as they were 18 centuries ago when Marcus Aurelius first wrote them in his book on Meditations. Our life is what our thoughts make it. By talking to yourself every hour of the day, you can direct yourself to think thoughts of courage and happiness, thoughts of power and peace. By talking to yourself about the things you have to be grateful for, you can fill your mind with thoughts that soar and sing. By thinking the right thoughts, you can make any job less distasteful. Your boss wants you to be interested in your job so that he'll make more money. But let's forget about what the boss wants. Think only of what getting interested in your job will do for you. Remind yourself that it may double the amount of happiness you get out of life, for you spend about 1/2 of your waking hours at your work, and if you don't find happiness in your work, you may never find it anywhere. Keep reminding yourself that getting interested in your job will take your mind off your worries and, in the long run, will probably bring promotion and increased pay. Even if it doesn't do that, it will reduce fatigue to a minimum and help you enjoy your hours of leisure.